question number 4. And the first question is, what literary devices were most helpful in better understanding the novel?
So for the Man in the High Castle, so the first literary device is symbolism. So the I Ching is like a Chinese book brought by the Japanese immigrants and adopted like a few Jew and some Americans. Like the I Ching is a like an element that keeps like reappearing in like the storyline. Frank uses it in like the art plot. Tagomi uses it in like the spy plot, and Juliana uses it in like the art spy plot. People who use the Oracle talk about it explicitly as like tying all these things together. And the I Ching is like a symbol seriously tied to like the themes and like the fate of history. In the Man in the High Castle, the I Ching is may tell like one's like future like that their role in that universe. So moving on to like motive. So each character seems to get their hands on like a Benson's novel, which is like the Grasshopper Lives Heavy at some point, which is actually like a real like book or novel. Its topic of conversation at the source home when Chilton, like when he goes for dinner there, it's spotted by like Wyndham Matson's girlfriend on her way out of her house. Bryce and Juliana read it, and since a Benson's novel is like revealed at the end to contain like an inner truth, it's as well as like a literal truth. So since it records readers like history as like apparently to as or sorry it's like it has some like real truth to it with the Allies winning World War II like in real time, and the novel like within becomes like a barometer which each character's relationship to like truth can be judged.
Nice. Personally, in my book, I think metaphors is something that the author used a lot, and it honestly helped me understand it a bit more, just because it feels like it gives a more detailed description of things, like in a way that's easier to understand for me. Um, a like quote from the book is, "She walks demurely, head down, red gloved, hands clasped in front, with short little steps like a trained pig on its hind legs." And I don't know. I feel like that just really puts it in my mind that like, wow, these women are just not treated good, because like it puts a different image in your mind than like, oh, she walked looking down a bit, like comparing her like a similes with like a pig is just, I don't know. It helped me understand it better.
Yeah, I would also say I kind of liked how she kind of used the colors that the women were wearing as like kind of a symbol to kind of show who was supposed to be who and what's kind of expected of them. So the wives wearing blue kind of symbolizes how they're going to be like more pure sort of people, whereas the handmaids wearing red kind of symbolizes they were kind of more unpure, I guess, kind of, and how like the like lower down women were wearing like brown or green, more like subdued kind of colors to kind of, because they're not supposed to be noticed as much in the society, was really cool. And yeah.
That sounds really nice. Interesting. And I think I agree with both you and Adam because in my book, I think both metaphors and symbolism are a big part of it. So there's a lot of metaphors and imagery in the book. There's a quote on page 1: "With the brass nozzle on his fists, with this great python spitting its venomous kerosene upon the world, the blood pounded in his head, his hands were the hands of some amazing conductor playing all the symphonies of blazing and burning to bring down the taters and charcoal ruins of history." And um, this was really helpful to kind of envision the story better and just understand more the meaning behind each detail in the story. Also, symbolism such as the fire representing the destruction, but also just like the suppression and stuff, but also power, and the books representing like knowledge and like life that's more meaningful and like their past life. It kind of like helped me better understand the importance of the book and like the different themes in it.
No, yeah, that's true. Actually, there's definitely some like forms of symbolism that'll really help you get like a better understanding of the novel since it's really in depth.
Yeah, for sure. And the next question is, which literary devices did the author rely on the most in the novel? Do you believe it enhanced the story or not? Please.
So for The Handmaid's Tale, I would say she relied a lot on metaphors. There were a lot of metaphors, pretty much everything she would describe through metaphor or simile. And also flashbacks. There was a lot of flashbacks in the book. Like the first half of it pretty much was just telling us stuff that had already happened, which is helpful because now we kind of understand where she's coming from when she's doing things or referencing things. But yeah.
Yeah, I know. I agree completely. I kind of wrote exactly that, just like metaphors and flashbacks. I think the metaphors did really enhance the story, in my opinion, because I kind of thought it made it more engaging to read because it took more time to like understand what she was trying to say. And also, I just think that she's a really good writer because like even like the most mundane metaphors she would do would be like kind of breathtaking at times. I don't know. I had to stop at times just to like really appreciate her writing because I think that she's a really good writer. The book is a bit slow with the flashbacks, but it's like you can appreciate the writing even if I don't really like the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. That like my book is also like really slow. Even though there's not a ton of flashbacks, it's like a really slow start, and it never really gets too like super exciting. There's not like one massive event, I guess. Like so the literary devices that like the author relied on a lot is like a few. So the first one is like point of view. So the point of view is like third person limited omniscient. So the novel like centers around a few like focal characters like Childen, which is like an American who owns like an antique store. Mr. Tagomi, like a Japanese trade representative. Frank Frink, like an out of work factory worker who like establishes a jewelry business, and like a Baines, which is like a spy, and Juliana, like an American and judo instructor living in like the Rocky Mountains. So like tone and mood, the novel like makes like extensive uses of like short like chopping sentences that sometimes leave off like or the like the mood of the novel is like very reflective and like foreboding. Again, like a protagonist, as I was saying before, is that there's like many protagonists in the book. Like this includes like Frank Frank, Juliana Frank, Mr. Tagomi, Childen, and Miss and Baines. The last is foreshadowing. But like before Bane's arrival, Tagomi receives like, a coded telegram that is like that refers to like a popular song like "Skim Milk masquerades as a cream," and this is on page 20. Like Tagomi rightly interprets this as like a sign that Mr. Baines like is not what he seems, what he is. And this like foreshadows the eventual revelation that Baines is like actually a spy, which his name is like Rudolph Wegener. So I'd say that it like for most of the time it definitely didn't like enhance the novel. It just kind of made it a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So my novel wasn't that slow of a start actually. It's also quite short, so that might be why. But it was definitely, as you said, sometimes it made and sometimes literary devices made the novel a little bit confusing because he uses a lot of imagery, and I found that he uses more imagery in the beginning part than like any other part, or just more than usual, and that was really it was kind of hard to start the book and start reading it because it was kind of confusing in the beginning. But I do think it enhances the novel because the symbols that he uses and the metaphors and the similes and the imagery, they all kind of contribute to like thinking about everything deeply. And as you said, Olivia, like sometimes if I saw like imagery or a metaphor that was kind of confusing, stepping back and like rereading it and like finding the meaning behind it kind of helped me better understand the book and kind of improved just my understanding of like the story and everything. So I do think they enhance the story, but sometimes it was a little bit confusing. Okay, so the next question is which literary devices could we do without in this novel?
So for me, I found there would be times where she would use three metaphors or similes back to back to describe something. Like on page in the book, she mentions these girls are sharing secrets, so she describes it as like secrets in school, like spy novels, like late night television. She could have picked one and gotten the same point across, I feel like. And then maybe the book would have been a bit shorter and a bit easier to understand because it's pretty, and I feel like she probably writes poetry, but sometimes it would make the book kind of confusing.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Also, I think that the author just uses, as we've said so many times before, just too many flashbacks. I feel like I don't know, it became a bit draining to read at times. Not so much anymore because it's kind of picked up pace, but just like as we've complained about, not complained about, but said before, like many, many, many times, I think our author, I don't know if it's intentional, but maybe she just gets carried away with like writing a story that's like poetry. If I went into the story knowing that it was going to be basically a book of poetry, I probably would have liked it more. But I thought it was just a book. I don't even. So yeah, I think just as you said, just going on and on and on about flashbacks or metaphors, going into a whole different world of symbolism.
No, that's pretty interesting actually. Yeah, there was definitely a lot of like symbolism used in mine that was kind of like it felt like unnecessary. It just kind of got me bored sometimes. That's definitely for sure. But also like the big thing I want to talk about is parallel narrative. And if you're unsure like what that is, parallel narrative is like story structures where the writer like incorporates two or more like separate storylines. So like they're usually linked by like a common character or event or like a theme. Like I've referenced parallel narrative many times in like previous discussions using the example that like imagine if you're watching four different movies at the same time and you have to analyze them afterwards. Like it gets very difficult and kind of annoying. Like, I do get the idea that you're using like multiple perspectives on the story or it makes it like more interesting and in depth. But for me as a reader, it's definitely difficult to understand like what's going on. Like for example, the author changes the storyline many times in the chapter and then revisits it like 5 pages later. It's definitely a good idea, like where the story is told in different perspectives, but it definitely should be like executed better.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think that for all of us, sometimes sometimes the literary devices can get confusing, as you said. For me, I think that imagery and the descriptive words and metaphors. I don't think he used quite as many metaphors as, for example, in *The Handmaid's Tale* there were, but I still think the imagery and just the poetic style of the writing sometimes was quite confusing, and maybe it would have been easier to understand if there was less of that. But I do think it still adds to the book, and if you really like descriptive wording and poetry and everything, I think it's a good book, and it has a lot of meanings in the writing. So
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good point that like everybody has like a different perspective and like what they would like to read and what they don't like to read. So it's very like opinionated and nothing is like a right answer.
exactly, yeah, for sure. The next question is, what is your favorite literary device in the novel?
I think personally for me, it was probably symbolism. And that's because everything that is like done in the book has some sort of symbol that can be attached to it. Like literally everything. For example, the handmaid's um, dress that they wear is the color red. And like there's just so much theory and symbols behind the color red. Like it symbolizes fertility and like blood and like sin. And I think that you can do that for almost anything. You can look at the color of everything that the people wear, you know, the blue for the higher ups and like the wall, and everything just has a symbol in my story.
Yeah, no, that's definitely for me too. Is symbolism. Like an example that like really stood out to me is like Chilton uses the term place like often signaling like this obsessive like preoccupation with the social class and station. So when Mr. Tagomi gets Chilton's name wrong, Chilton like starts to cringe. He gets like really upset with this and his own like lower social position, made apparent by like Tagomi's Aries getting like really upset. When Chilton visits the Nippon Times building where Tagomi's office is, he frets about whether he should like carry his own bags in or not. And also when the admiral comes to Chilton's shop and tells him that the pistols are forgeries, like that they're not real. Chilton considers like killing himself for having like lost his place in society. Like place becomes like a very important term that like symbolizes like preoccupation of social class, as I said before, in like the human mind, and it like really lacks, and the lack of place like conquers people's feelings as soon as like the power is like displaced or forgotten or something.
Yeah, I would say that I really enjoyed the use of like simile metaphor in this book because it was sometimes it was a little excessive, but it was good and done well at times. I also kind of liked what Olivia was saying with the symbolism. There's definitely a lot of symbols in this book, and yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think symbols are a big thing that are that I really like the symbols in this book as well. But I think one of my favorite things is the irony of Guy's character because and what happens because first he like burns books as his job, and he's kind of friends with his boss, or at least he agrees with what he says. But then he ends up kind of protecting books and then killing his boss. So towards the end, like it was very towards the end. So the situational irony is a great example of character development, and to me, it symbolizes how much the plot and Guy's character changes throughout the book. And the unexpected turn of events also helps me understand the theme of the book and how characters and people can change a lot, and that this change is greatly impacted by their environment and the information they have access to. So the next question is, what type of literary devices are most used in your novel, and why do you think that is?
So in The Man in the High Castle, the literary device that's used the most is illusions. Like there's sorry, there's lots of illusions that really relate to history. So for example, like Franklin Roosevelt, like on page 66 is I don't believe either of those letters belong to Franklin Roosevelt. The girl said, like this is an illusion because Franklin Roosevelt was like actually a president, but in The Man in the High Castle he was assassinated, and I think it was 1936. Another illusion is like Erwin Rommel. And so on page 70 it says, and once the British defeated Rommel, they could move their whole army back and up through Turkey to join the remnants of Russian armies and make a stand. Like, this is also an illusion because Rommel was like a German officer who was well known for like his impact in North Africa. The last one is Winston Churchill. And on page 70 again, it says, with stubbornness, the girl said, and if the Germans hadn't taken Malta, Churchill would have stayed in power and guided England to victory. How? Where? In North Africa. Churchill would have defeated Rommel finally. So William Madison Gothel. This is an illusion because Churchill was like the prime minister of Britain from 1940 to 1945. And what's ironic is that like what I really like about the novel partly is that they use like real examples that happened as like unlikely events that like seem like fake or something fake. Like for instance, I just said that Churchill would have been defeated by Rommel or would have defeated Rommel finally. However, this is like actually what happened in history is where Churchill defeated Rommel in North Africa.
Nice. I think as I've said before, metaphors are probably the most used in my novel, but also similar to Adam's book, I feel like illusions are there sometimes too as well. In chapter 2, there's like a thing that says, I know why there is no glass in front of the watercolor of blue irises, and why the windows only opens partly, and why the glass in it is shatterproof. It isn't running away they're afraid of. We wouldn't get far. It's those other escapes, the ones that you can open in yourself. And, it's basically saying like a metaphor for suicide is an escape. And so that's just an example of like illusions and metaphors all in one. And we see that just a lot in the novel.
Yeah, I would also say there's a lot of allusions to the Bible, to like religion and biblical terms. The names of all the shops in the village are tied to the Bible in some way. The term Martha to describe the cook and stuff is also from the Bible. Just a lot of the things here are tied to that. So I think if you are someone who knows more about the Bible, you might get a little bit more out of like that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think it makes sense for that to be there because it's a very religious society, so everything kind of being tied to that really helps to bring that part into the book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's actually a lot of references to the Bible in my book as well. I didn't really notice it the first time I read it, but when like reading back and looking through it, I noticed that there's definitely a lot of examples that could be throughout like all of the books that there's references to the Bible and everything's really religious.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. I think in my book there's references to so Faber is the guy that Guy meets that has experience in the world before, and he references some books from time to time, and nobody really understands those books because nobody has access to them. That's like an illusion. And then in my book, I think it's the most used ones are imagery, personification, similes, and metaphors, and they just kind of it's all part of like the poetic and descriptive language that's used from time to time. For example, on page 3, the autumn leaves blew over the moonlit pavement in such a way as to make the girl who was moving there seem fixed to a sliding walk, letting the motion of the wind and the leaves carry her forward. And I think these go along with the story because it's quite a dystopian society, and literary devices help the reader imagine the scene and the theme of the book, and just like the setting in general. And the similes and metaphors add to like the understanding of things and people in the story, their behaviors and like what they symbolize. And I think they're used the most because they really just add to the setting and our understanding of the book. The next question is, did paying more attention to literary devices help you better understand the novel, and why?
Personally, I think yes, and I think that this is for everyone's book, kind of. I feel like literary devices are just way more helpful in understanding books because it can create something that is more easily understandable by like mass audiences by using metaphors and similes, which creates connections in people's heads that like make them understand better. And yeah,
So sorry. So for the Man in the High Castle, I would say it's a combination between yes and no. Like some literary devices, such as like allusions and symbols, made it easier to like understand the novel. However, there were like lots of parts in the novel where I just didn't really just understand what was going on. I had to reread the book or like ask David to see if he knew what was going on, so we could talk about it, and like he could explain it to me. I would have had it a lot worse if I was like just reading the book by myself and I had like nobody to talk about it to, and like discuss like what was going on in that point of the book. I highly recommend if like you're going to read this book, have like regular conversations with someone to discuss like what's going on to make sure you're both like on track with what's happening in the novel.
Yeah, I would say literary devices definitely help with this book because, like, kind of like what Olivia was saying with metaphors and similes, like you might not have been, you've not been in this world, this doesn't exist, but
Yet.
you might have experienced something kind of like what she's relating it to help you kind of understand where they're coming from and kind of get more of a connection to it. So yeah, I definitely think they're helpful. Even if there might be a few too many, they are still overall, I would say, helpful for understanding.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think that they are quite helpful, and they really help us just like find like more deeper meaning in just ordinary things, like you said, like the color of their dress or something like that. And also, it just like helps us understand the story better. For example, there was also a flashback when Guy thought about his first time encountering Faber, and the moment in the park where Faber decided that he would probably see Montauk again, either while he was getting his house burnt down or for a friendly talk. And this was a moment in the book where they met for the first time, and it helps me kind of better understand the significance of their relationship and like where it started, and paying attention to like the symbols in the book, such as like fire, that represent destruction of knowledge and self-awareness, and other symbols help me better understand like just basically the book and the theme and everything like that. Okay, that's the end of discussion first.
By Mr. Barrington.